Okay, so my name is Dr. Susan Kavaler-Adler. I'm the founder and executive director of the Object Relations Institute, which we founded in 1991. At that time, I actually had a co-founder, Dr. Robert Weinstein, and he retired later, but I've been the executive director for now 32 years of the Institute. So today, I will be speaking about a topic that relates very much to my own work on developmental mourning, which is one of my theories, along with the demon lover complex and the love creativity dialectic. But developmental mourning is one of very important clinical theory. And I will be referring to this book, which you saw a picture of on the announcement. You saw the picture, but not the full title. It's my seventh book, and it's the first volume, 3 volumes of my selected papers being published, that are published by IP Books, International Psychoanalytic Books. A lot of the earlier books on mourning were published by Routledge, and the ones on women artists and writers were republished by ORI Academic Press, including, but Routledge still has Mourning, Spirituality, and Psychic Change, which a new object relations view psychoanalysis, which was published in 2003 by Routledge. In 2004, it got the Gradiva Award from the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. This book, Developmental Mourning, Erotic Transference, and Object Relations Psychoanalysis, has many articles on the developmental mourning process where you can see it in action in each clinical case. You see the transformation from in character disorders, from closet narcissism to self-integration, from borderline to self-integration, all kinds of different cases and psychic structures. And in the erotic transference part, I have my articles on mourning and erotic transference and lesbian homoerotic transference and dialectic with developmental mourning on the way to symbolism from the proto-symbolic, since going through developmental mourning always involves getting to a level of symbolism from the proto-symbolic and getting to the level of subjectivity and whole object relations from part objects and reactivity. So, and then in the third part on the groups that I talk about, you can particularly see the working out in 2 women of their negative mother transferences with each other in both a writing group of mine and then going into my meditative visualization mourning and therapy group, my monthly Saturday group, where I use meditative visualization. And that you can see the neurotic work there with the neurotic resolution of the negative mother transference between these 2 women. So you see a whole array of psychic structure and developmental arrest issues versus the neurotics with the who already have containing repression and ego, all the ego capacities developed, and they work more in the transference resistance mode of where they need interpretation of the unconscious transference dynamics to the conscious mind. It's quite different than dealing with the dissociation and the abandonment depression affects that James Masterson talks about in the character disorders. But there are many cases of that in the beginning of this book. There are much longer cases in the book on mourning, spirituality, and psychic change. And then in my book on psychic regret, the anatomy of regret, which was along with the Klein-Winnicott dialectic, were published by Carnac, and then Routledge took over Carnac. Those in that book, in Anatomy of Regret, I talk about in each of the cases, you see how working with regret is part of the developmental mourning process, and you can see that in each of the individual case studies in the book, The Anatomy of Regret. So I've been talking about mourning and developmental mourning for a long time. And this developmental mourning book has, as I said, a whole array of the psychic structures and work with developmental mourning. And that's the one published by IP Books. So today I want to go back to Freud for a moment, as is the habit in this field to say a few words about Freud. But Freud actually was the first who talked about object relations theory in his 1917 book, his 1970 article, Mourning and Melancholia, which was followed in 1940 by Melanie Klein's very, very important article on mourning and its relation to manic depressive states. And that all leads into my views on developmental mourning and in relation to Klein's depressive position, working with guilt as well as loss in the mourning process. And that gets back to the anatomy of regret, working with allowing regrets to become conscious so they can be worked with and faced rather than repeated in self-sabotage over and over again. So in 1917, in Mourning and Melancholia, Sigmund Freud, for the first time, made a statement of object relations thinking, although he went away from this afterwards in his drive theory. But his statement about object relations theory was that the shadow of the object falls upon the ego, meaning that the child of a parent is forced to identify with the parent. So that's where you get the identification with both positive and pathological aspects of the parent. And when there's a bad object parent in character disorders with developmental arrest, you get a whole constellation of the addiction to the internal bad object. And going through the mourning process for that involves a whole going through very primitive affect states that Masterson talks about in the abandonment depression. Higher level people mourn and they deepen their characters through mourning losses in their lives, going back to earlier losses, but without developmental arrest. In the character disorders, you have the developmental arrest in the first 3 years of life and so much in the second year of separation, individuation, where you have a traumatic disruption of bonding with the mother. And therefore, you have this constant need to deal with affects that the patient will dissociate. And so you're dealing with a patient who doesn't want to go there. And you have to be containing enough and providing enough of a holding environment in D.W. Winnicott's words, and providing enough of a processing environment in Wilfred Bion's words of processing beta into alpha, that you, and with the container and contain in Wilfred Bion's words, you have to get up to the place where the patient can tolerate the very aversive affects that they keep dissociating from developmental arrest. So Freud talked about the character, the parent falling upon the ego. Then Ronald Fairbairn came along, and in his 1952 papers, you can particularly see all of them gathered there about how he was one of the original spokesmen for an object relations axiom of the main yearning in human beings being towards connection, and all the defenses that come about in terror of connection when the mother is the bad object. In his words, if the only pie in the house and the only food in the house is a poison pie, the child is forced to eat the poison pie, or in other words, is forced to swallow the bad object parent. That is truly traumatizing. The bad object of Klein is more of the persecutory fantasy along with the idealized fantasy breast mother, and those are fantasy states, but she wasn't talking about the actual mother until later, about the good mother coming about through some integration of these fantasy objects. But for Fairburn, it was the very real parenting and the bad object parenting that he spoke about in all the problems with wanting connection in life and fearing it at the same time. So all three, Freud, Melanie Klein, and Ronald Fairburn, are originators of object relations thinking. And of course, then we have all the British theorists, and then the American theorists, including myself, but with Masterson as one of the ones I referred to because of the abandonment depression theory. And that relates to how you have a developmental mourning process, but that begins with the very profound affects that are dissociated from because of the agonizing intensity of the void states and the rage states and that precede getting to a level of loss and mourning and regret. So in the paranoid schizoid position of Klein, we have just all the persecutory anxiety. We're not at the level of guilt yet. We're not at the level of loss yet. We're in a state of persecutory terror. And that can continue throughout one's life if it's not worked with in a clinical situation. So Melanie Klein in Mourning and its relation to manic depressive states follows Freud's Mourning and Melancholia. But in Mourning and Melancholia, Freud speaks of the normal mourner. He is not yet speaking about mourning within the clinical situation. That began with Melanie Klein. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud speaks about the aggression being turned inward and blocking mourning and causing a melancholic condition versus someone who can truly mourn losses. And he was mainly talking about bereavement, although he does mention disappointment. But he wasn't talking about all separation, individuation issues. He was talking about bereavement. And he was seeing aggression as blocking the mourning process. But when we get to Melanie Klein in Mourning and its relation to manic depressive states in 1940, which she probably never would have written in that context if it hadn't been for Freud in Mourning and Melancholia in 1917. But in Mourning and its relation to manic depressive states, Melanie Klein uses herself as an example. She calls it Mrs. A and says it's a patient, but it's really herself, dealing with the loss of her son when he was 29, Hans, who died in a ski accident. And in that paper, she shows through her own process, as well as then going into examples with patients, that mourning is not always stopped by aggression. It can be facilitated if aggression is brought to a symbolic level. So through her own fantasies of destruction and hate and competition towards her deceased son, which goes back to her brother and her mother, because Klein was always going right back to the pre-Oedipal, everything being displaced and going back, and you get the symbolism of the current object going back and always to the mother. And she had a doozy of a brother too, tons of envy. Okay, so she talks about her own process and shows that her fantasies and dreams that had so much hostile aggression related to the paranoid schizoid position were she was able to bring through symbolic understanding into a mourning process where she eventually surrendered to grief and loss after being in a state of shock and everything being frozen and then being blocked, not being able to cry in a way that was at all helpful. just kind of evacuative crying in the beginning, but ultimately she gets up to grief mourning, and that comes through the surrender to grief after the aggression can be symbolized so it doesn't block the mourning process. So she actually shows how aggression can be part of the mourning process rather than a block to it, as Freud was talking about. It can certainly be a block to it, but if brought up to a symbolic level, and generally this treatment is often needed for this, then it can lead to a developmental mourning process. So my work in developmental mourning very much always had Melanie Klein's work in mind, because it was Melanie Klein who was the first one who talked about mourning as a critical, clinical, and developmental process. As I said, Freud just referred to the normal mourner, but he wasn't thinking of it as this is a clinical process of mourning. He was just comparing the melancholic with the mourner. But Melanie Klein in 1940, after Freud's 1917 paper, was able to talk about mourning as a critical, clinical, and developmental process, which gets into my theory of developmental mourning. So, and let me just see, yes, okay. So I want to also say that I will be speaking about this topic and giving examples and relating to questions you may have until 1:30, and then we'll be having a role play demonstration with Dr. Lorraine Dawes, who you can see here. He will be playing the part of a patient, and you can see in action me playing the part of the analyst and my comments in the interpretive responses containing and interpretive, but to show you in vivo demonstration the clinical process related to developmental mourning. But now I'd like to refer to a few cases that I have in this developmental mourning, erotic transference, and object relations psychoanalysis book. As I said, there are 22 chapters. All of them are related to the mourning process. Some of the ones I'll mention today are the one on opening up lot mourning in the pre-Oedipal character, which also resonates and has some continuing theory in the heartache paper, the opening up a blocked heartache in the beginning of heartache in the character disordered patient. And also a paper that these were originally journal articles. That's why it's called the selected first volume, I selected papers. These were journal articles, and there was originally, and there are now chapters in the book. So they're all gathered together here. And the one on my graduation is my mother's funeral. Also, I'll be mentioning today because it has to do with a mother regressively holding on to the child in separation, individuation, and then how the mourning process can flourish through the clinical situation. So in opening up lot mourning in the pre-Oedipal character, I speak about a woman whose mother died when she was 8, but she was still in a somewhat symbiotic state with the mother. But when she was left at 8, her father became very abusive towards her, and so a lot of her transference with me in the beginning was related to the aversive sadistic father, and as well as yearnings for the symbiotic mother. But what we got up to was a culmination of the work of getting through the developmental arrest and opening up a critical mourning process, coming about through working with the split off rage. Now, one of the things that Otto Kernberg talks about, who of course is one of the American object relationists, he was trained in the Kleinian Institute in Chile, but then he adopted a lot of ego psychology, particularly of, well, what's her name? I'm sorry, forgetting her name right now. In any case, I'll come back to me. But he was influenced by both Kleinian thinking and ego psychology. But you can see in all the defenses he talks about, going back to his book in 1975 on borderline conditions and pathological narcissism. Borderline conditions and pathological narcissism in 1975, Otto Kernberg. In that book, you can see all the defenses described are Kleinian terms. And he thinks in terms of the Kleinian progression from paranoid schizoid to the depressive position, which I do and which I teach about and which I use I use Thomas Ogden's Matrix of the Mind book every year in the introductory course to show the movements with very good clinical examples of movements from paranoid schizoid to depressive position. But I always also relate that to the analogies in Margaret Mahler in a linear theory of separation individuation, which influenced James Masterson's American object relations theory so much, as well as Althea Horner's object relations theory and my own. So always looking at both the movements from the paranoid schizoid to depressive position and movements from developmental arrest or in separation individuation phases to successful separation individuation and the development of the hatched individual, separate, unique and self and true self that can come out of working with arrest and developmental in the separation individuation phases. So the woman I was mentioning, who I worked with, I believe in maybe late 1970s, 1980s, it's an old paper, maybe 1980s, it was published in the American Journal of Psychoanalysis in 1995. And this was somewhat limited compared to some of the other treatments here that with like the Mourning and Neurotic transference one and the lesbian homoerotic transfer. A lot of them were 3 or 4 times a week patients, but this woman was once and twice a week. It was alternating because of her schedule. So we weren't working with that many sessions a week. And yet we went through the most profound opening up of the developmental mourning process. And at first, as I said, there was an oscillating transference between me being the bad object father and my being the symbiotic mother she was yearning for. And it would go back and forth because both of these were her main internal objects. As Freud said, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego. So her shadows were this father who became sadistic towards her and actually sexually assaultive when she was a teenager, very abusive and controlling towards her after the mother died when she was 8. He'd never been that way when the mother was alive and she was catering to his needs. But she had the bad object father and she had the mother that she in some ways rejected, but was also symbiotically tied to. The mother never really encouraged her verbal development, even though she was quite capable of it. But the mother was there was kind of a silence and so there was a symbiotic kind of silence between her and the mother. But the loss of the mother was incredibly profound. However, first there was all the rage related to her fate with losing the mother and her father and the arrest that she had. So she in development, and she would have dreams about nuclear explosions and Holocaust, which or ones that she would explain as Holocausts or nuclear explosions. But we got up to a point where her rage came into the sessions with me, and we're there in the transference. And I was at that time a part object, either the bad father or the idealized symbiotic mother. So there were part object transferences. But when she got up to the rage with me, she started saying things like she'd like to smash all. At that time I had plants in my office. She wanted to smash my windows, smash my plants. She tried to, when I opened the door for her to leave one day, she tried to turn it around so she was shutting the door. I mean, it was kind of a power struggle that she was in, as well as, the first expressions of the rage. But then the rage, the real visceral level of rage that can be so critical in getting to the dissociated connection with the object, came into the session with me in one session where she called me earlier in the day and said, could she change her session time? And I said, no, I declined that request. And because she said it was raining and she was tired, whatever, I said, no, she has to come in her usual time. So she came into the session in a rage, and that's where the visceral intensity of the rage came out. And she was screaming at me about, how I didn't care about her, and I didn't care. She was so exhausted and tired and all this. And as she went through that in one session, there was a new connection formed. And what Otto Kernberg talks about is how the defenses against the primal oral, what he calls the oral rage, the primal pre-edible rage, it's the defenses against that stop the ego development, the development towards symbolization, free association, and all that. So you can see that very clearly in this case, because once she was able to express the rage right to me and didn't have to be afraid of it, the next session, she came in with all these dreams where for the first time, she had dreams before, but this was the first time that she was able to associate to the dreams. And we were getting to a symbolic level. And one of the dreams, there was a part where she said, like, you have to remember, this was in the early 1990s. I published in 1995. So Ronald Reagan was president. So in the dream, she had me as Ronald Reagan, which was the bad father for her. And then she was this young Black guy who was on a bicycle delivering a pizza to me. And she said she was perplexed because she didn't know why I, as Ronald Reagan, gave her so much more money than she was requesting as the fee for the pizza. And she was really starting to wonder about this. This is a whole different level for her after the rage, to be able to reflect on something and, associate it to the dream and wonder, like, in a curious way, having curiosity now, not just reactivity. She was able to say, I wonder why you were giving me so much money. So at that moment, I made an interpretation that opened up the mourning process. But I said to her, consciously, you feel like you're giving, giving, and giving to me, and I'm not giving you anything, because that was her bad object transference. But I said, but unconsciously, it's just the opposite. You feel like I'm giving and giving and giving to you, and you giving and giving and giving to you, and you're using me up just like you felt you used up your mother and killed her. At that moment, she starts screaming with this kind of almost ecstatic ecstatic like light bulb going off in her head, but also screaming, I did it, I did it, I did it, I did it. Because all of these years she felt that she had killed her mother, who died of cancer. And so at that moment, she screamed that I did it, I did it, I did it. And she became aware she had always believed she had killed her mother. But she also surrendered in that moment to the grief and started sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And what we see here is not only that she got to the affect that she was terrified of before with the rage and the grief, but she got to a natural opening up of the ego functions as she was surrendered to grief. She got to free association, symbolization, object constancy, self-reflection, all these things that the ego psychologists talked about in terms of functioning. You don't have to deal with functioning if you deal with the affects or the developmental mourning process, because it happens naturally that the ego functionings come back, especially when it's a case like Kernberg talked about, where the symbolism is blocked by the defense against the rage, the terror, the dissociated rage, the terror of the rage causes the symbol, proto-symbolism as opposed to symbolism, the lack of symbolic capacity being used when they're defense against the rage. So this would be a case that shows Otto Kernberg theory right in terms of the defense against the rage was blocking this, what came about so naturally now as the affect of grief and mourning came about. Also, what came about was her ability to symbolize, have free associations for the first time, have curiosity and self-reflection as opposed to just reactivity where she wanted to smash my office and wanted to, smash me basically. But, just the reactivity and thoughts about her reactivity. It was, or words that were weapons or caresses. So before you get to symbolism, you have no interpretations are taken in symbolic form. So you can interpret all day and night, but if you have part objects related to Klein's idealized breast and persecutory breast, or in terms of the bad father and the part object symbiotic mother, as long as you have part objects, any interpretation will not be heard at a symbolic level. It will be heard either as warm caresses if she's in the part object symbiotic mother transference, or it will be heard as an attack if I'm the bad object in her present state, her self state at that time. If I'm the bad object, then my words will be not heard in terms of content, but heard in terms of that they're like weapons of attack, and she feels the reactive rage and attack. So it's only when we get to the symbolism and the mourning process that interpretation is heard in its symbolic form. So you can see here that my interpretation was heard as the one about in the unconscious. It's the opposite of the conscious belief you have that you're giving and giving to me, and I'm not giving you anything back. The opposite is true in your unconscious, and you feel like I'm giving and giving to you, and you're using me up just like you felt you used up your mother and killed her. See, at that moment when she erupted with, it really felt like an eruption of I did it, I did it, I did it, I did it. That she believed at that point. She talked about this afterwards, that she had always believed she killed her mother, but she didn't realize it. And so at that moment, she freed herself and surrendered to the grief. But what was also true was she heard my words in symbolic form. The content of my interpretation was heard, not just it's a warm caress or it's a cold father attack. It was from the part objects. It was heard in terms of the symbolism of the actual words. And she got there by us going through her expressing the most feared, dissociated, visceral, oral level rage towards me. Once she expressed it, she was free of that, all the defense against it, and her ego function started. So she was able to symbolize and to hear my interpretation symbolically. Thomas Ogden talks about in Matrix of the Mind about the interpreting subject and the historical subject. So the interpreting subject is someone who knows they're interpreting something, and therefore they can take interpretations because they understand what an interpretation is. It's not just an attack or a holding or caressing of them. It's a symbolic communication. So an interpreting subject, when someone is developmentally arrested, they're not an interpreting subject, and they can't understand that anyone else has their own subjective perspectives, and they can't understand that they're making interpretations. They just think that whatever is in their mind, and they're not even aware that they're having thoughts and feelings. They're just reacting like, you did this to me, I'm going to do it back to you. There's not an understanding that they're interpreting anything when they voice what their thoughts and feelings. So the interpreting subject comes about through the developmental mourning process, as does the historical subject, in Thomas Ogden's words too, where the person begins to understand that what happens has consequences, and that there's a history, which makes it very different in terms of the working alliance, because the working alliance can only come about when you have whole object relations. Otherwise, you have the very fragile narcissistic alliance, which can be broken in a second. And Ogden also talks about the shock, which I think all of us have felt, when a borderline patient, just cuts off everything, and right away you're demonized and everything you did before is forgotten. So that's someone without who's not a historical subject. There's no memory and sense of consequence of one thing leading to another. Everything can be cut off in a second. Of course, it can go the other way and be cut off into an idealization too. But generally, we're speaking about where the therapy is cut off because a person is suddenly sees you as the bad object. The splitting takes place, become the bad object. You're not a whole object, so they can just say they're going to leave you. And that's typical of many borderlines. So, and there are higher and lower borderlines, but the distancing borderline particularly will tend to be cutting off and leaving. So the shock that the therapist feels about this is because they have to, it helps, let me put it that way, helps to know the theory that the person is not a historical subject, because then you know what's going on. That suddenly you're dropped and, like nothing happened before. All the things you were supposedly working with them on, talking about with them, out the window, it's gone. At the moment of the splitting, when you're out the window, okay, because there's that reactive splitting and the switch to you being the bad object. So for the woman that I was talking about, she moved into symbolism and subjectivity. She moved into being able to understand that she was interpreting things. She became an interpreting subject because she was able to see that she was interpreting that her mother was killed by herself unconsciously. She wasn't thinking this consciously. She knew the mother died of cancer, but unconsciously, she believed she killed the mother. So when she became conscious of it, she went, oh, yeah, I must have always thought I killed my mother. She realized that she was interpreting something, that she had interpreted that she had killed her mother, but that wasn't reality. And so she became an interpreting subject. She became a symbolic person with free associations. Self-reflection developed. Object constancy goes along with being a historical subject, because if you know that you had a history with this other person, including a therapist, suddenly going to not have that history, and you're going to then you know that there's something there to talk about with the therapist if you're having thoughts about leaving. So it's moving into being a historical subject is also object constancy developing in the ego. So all these ego functions naturally develop when you get past the defense against the primitive rage that she had dreams about nuclear explosions. And then it came into that visceral rage towards me in the moment. And then she, after that session, had these dreams, and I was able to make an interpretation where she could respond as an interpreting subject. She took in the symbolic meaning of what I said. It came out of my unconscious very spontaneously about, unconsciously, it's the opposite, that you think that I'm giving and giving to you and you're using me up just like you felt you used up your mother and killed her. I mean, that just came to me in that moment. So, because I was connected to her and my unconscious, reading her unconscious, but the symbolic meaning is what opened up the mourning process, not just her idealizing or feeling held or anything like that. It was the symbolic meaning that she realized that she was always believed that she killed her mother. And that allowed her to surrender to grief. And it's interesting in terms of comparing that to Melanie Klein in Mourning and its relation to manic depressive states in 1940, how Klein herself went from shock, and these hostile, aggressive fantasies into, when she understood those, brought them to a symbolic level. She talked about her being able to, for the first time, cry in a whole different way, where she was actually grieving, and it was grief, sadness, not just evacuation of tension and stuff. It became real grief, sadness in the crying. So of course there are many different kinds of crying, but grief, sadness is a sign of being in the depressive position and of the developmental mourning process proceeding. So I will mention D.W. Winnicott having a somewhat contrasting view with Otto Kernberg, but I believe he was talking about different patients. Instead of believing that symbolism would return naturally if the defense against a dissociated rage was surrendered because the person could express the rage to the therapist, the analyst, instead of believing that the defense once surrendered, could allow for symbolism to naturally evolve that was already there. Winnicott talks about needing to develop the symbolic capacity. Now, I think there was, Kernberg would speak about this in disagreement with Winnicott, but I think Winnicott may be citing different patients where I believe with that patient, even though she never really separated from the mother, there was a positive kind of symbiotic relationship with the mother. And I think there was the development of capacity for symbolism. She got totally traumatized after the mother's death, by the death and then by the father. And she tried living with her sister-in-law who was younger, and she always wanted a younger mother, but she wanted her real mother, and she went back. So she was stuck with that father, and that was very unfortunate. But she did have that symbolic capacity. It's an open question whether other patients need to develop the symbolism capacity more with the therapist, rather than just opening up blocks against primitive aggression. But opening up the blocks to primitive aggression is all part of the developmental mourning process. It's opening up all the affects, and it also can go back to the void states. James Masterson talks about this when he's talking about abandonment depression as a result of developmental arrest because of trauma in the separation individuation period. And he will talk about different character structures having at different times, the schizoid having in the differentiation phase at the beginning of separation individuation, and Margaret Mahler's schema of linear schema, and the narcissist going back to the defense of the practicing period with the grandiosity, and then the borderline having a rapprochement conflict, having the trauma at rapprochement, and the mother who wants to hold on to them, not let them go, have independence, starts to feel trapped or abandoned, and damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either you're trapped or you're abandoned because the mother won't be there and support you emotionally. If you are independent, then you feel trapped. All those, they take place different times in the separation individuation phases. But Masterson's talking about abandonment depression as a result of whatever phase that comes about. And the earlier it is, the more there is also the sense of a void inside. I often refer to Emily Dickinson, a study of mine in one of my earlier books, The Compulsion to Create Women Writers and Their Demon Lovers. And I have a big study on different writers, including Emily Dickinson, and her schizoid personality was so vivid in her poetry about the abyss. So Masterson talks about a void states that need to be tolerated within the holding environment with the therapist, or with the therapist as the container for the contained of the patient. So the void experience is also there's not always rage right away. And sometimes it's more of it, just the absence and the void, the abyss. But you do get as you become more of an object, there's the rage that's there towards the bad object. And then there's ultimately the surrender to grief and mourning, but that takes a long time when there's character disorder, disruption. I think with the woman I'm mentioning, it was shorter period of time. It was about 4 years, so 4.5 years maybe, till she got to surrender to grief. But of course, with more serious early trauma in separation individuation, earlier than what she had with the mother's death at 8, it may take a lot longer than that to get anywhere near the depressive position, or the and the mourning process and the developmental mourning process. So I overlap with Masterson in our view of how important it is to be there with the patient when they experience formally dissociated affect states that have felt intolerable to them when they were alone. And I will say to the patient, you know, this was intolerable, but it can become tolerable when you're not alone, when I'm here with you. So these, and you know, sitting with the abyss, with the void, with the rage, you know, which can become that very intense visceral rage that this woman went through. And then then the grief is like relief, you know, oh, we finally got there to the grief, the loss and the surrender, and feels wonderful. But I mean, it's painful for the patient, but the grief also is on a developmental trajectory when you're dealing with the developmental mourning and moving from developmental rest into transformation and self-integration and separation, individuation. So the mourning process too can go from having intense pain in it to having more of love in it. And that also comes about in combination with the therapist being a new and more, even though you can be seen as the persecutor anytime in the transference, in reality, if you become a good enough object being there to contain things, then the intolerable can become tolerable. And in mourning, it moves from pain in the morning and holding on in the morning to more release in the morning and to love in the morning. And ultimately, of course, to just feel touched by things and feel a sense of tears coming to the eyes and feel loving connection and sadness at the same time. Like sadness is such sweet sorrow in Shakespeare's terms. So there is a progression within the affectivity of the mourning and grief affects as well. Now, before I go on to mention any other cases or dynamics, I'd like to see if anyone wants to ask questions related to what I've said. And let me see. Yeah, why don't we take a 5-minute bathroom break and then come back in 5 minutes, and during the 5 minutes, you can see if you have a question you want to ask, and then we can go on from there for the lecture period until the role play. Okay, so we'll be back in 5 minutes.